So, today we're diving into the incredible story of how modern India was really forged. We're going to trace that journey, a full century, from a single explosive uprising that nearly broke an empire, all the way to the birth of the world's biggest democracy. All right, let's get into it.
And here's the big question we're tackling. How did one single revolt, way back in 1857, set off a chain reaction that would completely remake the Indian subcontinent and change its relationship with Britain forever? This is a story of action, reaction, and ultimately, revolution.
We're going to break this story down into 5 parts. First, we'll feel that jolt to the system. Then, we'll see how the empire responded with an iron grip. After that, we'll witness an Indian awakening, which leads us right into the age of Gandhi. And finally, we'll take a hard look at the complicated colonial inheritance that was left behind.
Okay, let's start at the epicenter, the earthquake itself, the 1857 revolt. This is the moment the ground literally shifted under the British Empire, and it forced a reaction that would define the next 100 years.
The year is 1857. You really have to get this date in your head. This wasn't just some small skirmish, it was a flashpoint. It was the moment Britain realized it had to completely change its game plan for ruling India. Everything that comes after this is a direct result of what happened in this one year.
And that's not me being dramatic. The sources from the time describe it exactly like this, a severe jolt to the British administration. It completely exposed how fragile their control actually was. It made a total overhaul of their power structure, not just an idea, but an absolute necessity if they wanted to hang on.
So, how did Britain react to that jolt? Well, they didn't loosen their hold. They clamped down, and they clamped down hard. This next part of the story is all about how the empire tightened its iron grip, determined to make sure a revolt like that could never, ever happen again.
And this timeline, it's pretty revealing, because it shows you just how methodical they were. First, in 1858, they make it official, power goes from a private company directly to the British Crown. Then, in 61, they create this council that gives the illusion of Indian input, but it has no real power. It's just for show. And the reforms that follow might look good on paper, but they were all about efficiency, making it easier and cheaper for Britain to rule, not about giving India any genuine path to self-government.
And if you want to know the thinking behind all this, just listen to the people who are in charge. This is a quote from Charles Wood, the Secretary of State for India in 1861. He's not exactly hiding the ball here. He's basically saying the only way to rule a conquered people is through absolute power, a despotism. So you have to remember, every single one of those administrative changes we just saw was designed to reinforce this one core belief.
So how do you maintain that kind of absolute power over a place as huge and diverse as India? Well, the British had a playbook for that, and its most famous strategy was divide and rule. The logic is brutally simple. If the people you rule are fighting each other, they can't unite to fight you. So they deliberately fueled divisions, pitting prince against people, caste against caste, and most consequentially, Hindus against Muslims.
And here is a perfect visual example of that policy in action. The army. After 1857, the Indian army was completely rebuilt. The groups that had been part of the revolt, suddenly they were labeled non-martial, and recruitment from those areas just stopped. Instead, the British started heavily recruiting from groups that had helped them crush the revolt, like Punjabis, Gurkhas, and Pathans. They even created regiments based on specific castes and religions to make sure, as one British official put it, that the army was a mix of mutually antagonistic groups.
But, and this is so important, while the British were busy tightening their grip, something else was happening just beneath the surface. A kind of Indian awakening was taking shape, an intellectual and social revolution that would plant the seeds for a whole new kind of resistance. At the heart of this awakening was a massive shift in thinking. A new generation of Indian intellectuals, exposed to Western ideas about liberty and justice, started questioning everything. Blind faith and old traditions started giving way to a new spirit of rationalism. Social customs weren't just accepted anymore. They were put to the test of reason.
And this new spirit wasn't just talk. It sparked a wave of powerful reform movements. Leaders like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Jyotiba Phule, they weren't just debating ideas. They were on the ground, attacking the biggest social problems of the day: the brutal caste system, child marriage, the oppression of women. They argued that India couldn't be strong politically until it was strong socially. And really, this internal house cleaning was the crucial groundwork that made a future mass movement for independence even possible.
And that national regeneration, it finds its ultimate champion in our next section,
the age of Gandhi. This is where all those intellectual ideas, which had mostly been for the educated elite, just explode into a nationwide mass movement for independence.
The engine of this whole movement was a completely revolutionary idea from Mahatma Gandhi called satyagraha. It literally means truth force, and it's so important to get this. This was not passive resistance. It was an active, incredibly powerful philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience. The goal was to challenge the moral right of the British Empire to rule, and frankly, to awaken the conscience of the entire world.
So how did it actually work? Well, the Salt March of 1930 is the textbook example. First, Gandhi issues an ultimatum, laying out the moral case against British rule. Then comes the symbolic action. He leads this epic 240-mile march to the sea to break the deeply unfair salt tax. And that one simple act of defiance, it inspires millions of people to join in, to nonviolently break the law themselves, totally overwhelming the colonial government. That, right there, is satyagraha in action.
Which brings us to our final section. After decades of struggle, India finally wins its independence in 1947. But what did the British leave behind? What was this colonial inheritance? Well, it's a really complex and often contradictory legacy.
Okay, let's start with the money. Because at its heart, the British Empire was an economic machine. And this number, it's just staggering. By 1882, an estimated 4% of India's entire economic output wasn't being put back into India, it was being shipped directly to Britain. This wasn't just trade, it was a systematic drain of wealth from the colony to the mother country.
Now, people who defend the empire will often say, but what about all the infrastructure they built, like the railways? And yes, they did. But this chart tells you who they were really building it for. The vast majority of investment went into projects that helped British business and military interests. Getting resources out of the country and moving troops around it. Meanwhile, investment in things that would have actually helped the Indian people, like education and healthcare, was kept incredibly low.
So in the end, we're left with this really messy, contradictory legacy. On the one hand, yes, the British left behind things like a unified government, a modern legal system, and financial markets. But on the other hand, they also left behind weak institutions that weren't built for equitable growth, a legacy of massive economic exploitation, and those deep social and religious divisions that were intentionally made worse by divide and rule, scars that, you could argue, are still healing today.
And all of this leaves us with the one big question that historians are still debating. When you look at the whole story, the jolt of 1857, the iron grip that followed, the Indian awakening, the incredible fight for freedom, and the final inheritance, was this century of foreign control ultimately more harm than good for India's long-term development? There's no easy answer, but it's a question you have to ask to understand the India we see today. Thanks for joining me.